Welcome. Oh, a lot of people here. Professor Weiner, learned colleagues, representatives of the American Embassy and of the Fulbright Commission, dear students, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Uppsala University and this year's Fulbright Lecture. In 1946, Senator J. William Fulbright of Arkansas established the Fulbright Program. He proposed a new program for educational cooperation between the United States and countries around the world, funded by war reparations and foreign loan repayments. The main objective was to increase the mutual understanding between the people of the United States and other nations through sharing of ideas, knowledge, skills, and individual experiences. When SINAS was created in 1985, and that was 34 years ago, then, and still it is the only center of North American studies in Sweden. And it was created in the very same spirit as the Fulbright Program. The insight was that more knowledge has to be shared, that the understanding of the world's most powerful country has to increase. Over the years, SINAS have benefited greatly from cooperation with the Fulbright Program and has hosted a number of Fulbright scholars and lecturers, all of whom have taught courses and or conducted research at the Institute. At Uppsala University, we have done our best to honor Senator Fulbright's vision and example. I believe he would have approved and that he would have considered his ideas accepted and integrated here. Today's lecture is the 23rd in this series, organized by the Swedish Institute of North American Studies, together with the English department. And Professor Mark Weiner's lecture has the title, Understanding Trumpism, American Politics and Culture in an Age of Globalization. The subject is, in my opinion, exactly in line with the Fulbright intentions. Sweden and United States have very close ties, and we in Sweden may think we fully understand the US. Clearly, the surprising events of recent years have shown that there are gaps in our understanding. My conclusion from this is that we need to pay more attention to American society, especially those aspects that are unfamiliar to us. And the best way to do is so to engage in the free and open academic study of the United States, as we do here at Uppsala University and is done at universities throughout the world. Therefore, I'm really looking forward to hearing Professor Weiner to help us understand the era of President Donald Trump in the United States. And I can see I share that interest with many of you here today. I would also like to point out that the Fulbright Program has an enormous impact on many people's lives. In total, around 370,000 Fulbrighters from over 165 countries have participated in the Fulbright Program. Uppsala University is just one proud member of that family, both as a recipient institution and as a home to grantees. A permanent Fulbright chair was established at SINAS and Uppsala University in 1996 and has, since its creation, contributed significantly to the spread of American studies in Sweden. Now, I would like to welcome all Fulbrighters here today. as I'm indeed proud and honored to welcome this year's holder of the Fulbright Chair, Professor Mark Weiner. I would also like to take the opportunity to thank all of you who are involved in organizing this event. And now, let me give the floor to Professor Dag Blank, who will introduce today's speaker. Please, Professor Blank.
Thank you very much, Rector Magnifica, representatives of the American Embassy, colleagues, students, ladies and gentlemen. I would also like to welcome you to the 2019 Fulbright Lecture. As we just heard, we have the Fulbright Chair of American Studies here at Uppsala, and it is of great importance for us at SINAS, the Swedish Institute for North American Studies, to each year have the privilege of receiving a prominent American professor who can help us interpret the United States and who can help us in the teaching of American studies and who has become a very important part of our research milieu. Looking back over the past years, some 20 years, it's hard to overestimate the significance that this program has, with all these people coming through and all the contacts that it creates and all the contacts that we still have with former grantees. So it's a very important example of exchange of ideas and contacts that lasts and spans the Atlantic, has spanned the Atlantic for several decades. So my heartfelt thanks to the Fulbright Commission, Erik Jönsson, its director, and many board members are here today. I'd also like to express our gratitude to the very important support for SINAS and our programming that we get from the Marianne and Marcus Wallenberg Foundation, today here represented somewhere by Ingrid Sundström. Thank you also to you. Today's speaker then is the 2018-19 holder of the Distinguished Chair of American Studies at Uppsala University, Mark S. Weiner. He is a professor of law at Rutgers University in Newark, New Jersey, where he teaches constitutional law and legal history. He was educated at Stanford and Yale universities and has a PhD in American Studies from Yale and also a JD from the Yale Law School. His research focuses on the relationship between the government and individual freedom, issues of race and American citizenship, and law, culture, and historical consciousness. He is the author of 4 award-winning books, including Black Trials, Citizenship from the Beginnings of Slavery to the End of Caste, Americans Without Law, The Racial Boundaries of Citizenship, The Rule of the Clan, What an Ancient Form of Social Organization Reveals About the Future of Individual Freedom, and Law's Picture Books. The Rule of the Clan received the Grawemeyer Award for Ideas Improving World Order, and has been translated into Swedish in 2015 as Klanvälde, från stamsamhälle till rättsstat. He has 2 previous Fulbright experiences, one at the University of Akureyri on Iceland, and one at the University of Salzburg in Austria. He's also a very active participant in the public discourse outside the strictly academic world. He's a regular contributor of op-ed pieces, including several now in Dagens Nyheter, and is also a documentary filmmaker. So you can hear this is a very versatile and a very interesting person. Those of you who have met Mark and his wife Stephanie, who is also with him this year, know that they represent the best in the American academic world and the Fulbright program. Always curious, willing to discuss and learn, and eager to meet and engage with students and colleagues in Uppsala and elsewhere in Sweden. I have never seen any Fulbright professor travel so much in Sweden and make so many contacts in Sweden as Mark and Stephanie have. It's truly amazing. So it's a true pleasure to invite Professor Mark Weiner to give the 2019 Fulbright Lecture on the topic, as we heard, Understanding Trumpism, American Politics and Culture in the Age of Globalization. Please join me in welcoming Mark Weiner.
Thank you so much. I have to get the most essential thing for a good talk. Doc, thanks for that really kind introduction, and thanks to all of you for coming. A special thanks to Vice Chancellor Eva Åkesson, to the Chargé d'Affaires of the U.S. Embassy, Clifford Bond, and to the Fulbright Commission in Sweden, including its engaged board. I see a number of board members here tonight, and to its tireless staff and director, Monica, Maria, and Eric. I'm sure that I share with all my fellow Fulbrighters here in the audience tonight a deep appreciation for all that they do on behalf of Swedish-American friendship. Now, since the time that my wife, Stephanie, who's there in the audience, and I arrived in Sweden in late August, and we've had a marvelous 7 months here, scarcely a day has gone by when I haven't met someone new and been asked, quite understandably, what I thought about the election and presidency of Donald Trump. The Swedish interest in President Trump is intense. He is the single most discussed person in Swedish media, and for good reason. What happens politically in the United States is deeply consequential across the world, and our policy choices can have a profound impact on your country and all the nations of Europe, especially in the field of international security. In addition, simply as a matter of personal style, Trump is a highly unusual chief executive, a fact that he regularly highlights himself. And now that the Mueller investigation is complete, interest in this unusual and consequential figure is only likely to grow. So to respond to the question that Swedes have asked me, tonight I'd like to talk both retrospectively about Donald Trump's electoral victory, how did it happen, and prospectively about Trumpism as a movement. What does it mean? Now, for full disclosure, I should say that I am a registered Democrat, and I even did some volunteer work for the Clinton campaign, but I'll be speaking primarily as a scholar, one interested in the relation especially between culture, constitutionalism, and the liberal rule of law. My concerns are philosophical and nonpartisan, and ultimately they concern Sweden as much as they do the United States. Here's how I'm going to proceed. I'm first going to describe in rhetorically neutral, cool terms how I think Donald Trump won the 2016 election. That description is going to be pretty granular. Now then, in the second part of my talk, I'm going to meditate in a more abstract way on Trumpism as a movement of politics and a movement of ideas. And to do that, I'll first describe how populism in general, and Trumpism in particular, is a political response to a growing crisis of democratic representation and community identity, one driven by globalization. And I'm going to explain that in sociological terms. Next, turning to philosophy, I'll lay out some arguments about the nature of political community made by the German anti-liberal legal theorist Carl Schmitt, with whose work aspects of President Trump's domestic and foreign policy agenda strongly resonate. And finally, I'll conclude with some reflections on the meaning of Trumpism for the future of liberalism and the liberal democratic tradition, after which we can gather together on the balcony, have some snacks. I understand there are snacks. There are snacks. It's going to be a great talk then. And we can chat about these important issues together. So, with sufficient hindsight and good polling data, the reason for Donald Trump's victory in 2016 has become, I think, pretty clear as a matter of electoral politics. When historians tell the tale 50 years from now, this is how I think it'll go. The story begins in what we call the primaries. These are elections held between February and June in which American political parties choose their candidates for the general election that takes place every 4 years. In the primary campaign, Trump traded on his public reputation as a successful businessman to capture the imagination of many politically active Republicans. Primary voters are the most energetic and engaged part of the electorate. And in recent decades, many of them in the GOP have become dissatisfied with the traditional career leadership of their party. And that dissatisfaction only deepened after the 2008 financial crisis and through the continuing wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. The congressional election of 2010, in which insurgent candidates from the Tea Party made extensive gains, showed how such dissatisfaction could be translated into electoral victory. As an outsider candidate, Trump accordingly engaged in what, from a business perspective, would be called a hostile takeover of the organization, using its most activist shareholders to push out old management. And what he offered was an agenda of tightened border security and immigration restriction, highly charged nativist and racialist rhetoric, especially about Latin Americans and Muslims, a confrontational economic stance toward China, a protectionist one toward domestic industries hard hit by technological change, skepticism of extended military commitments overseas, and a pugilistic, get things done, norm-busting style, a style whose attractiveness only grew in proportion to establishment outrage against it. The GOP formally nominated Trump as its candidate at the end of July, and a 3.5-month campaign followed. Over the course of that campaign, rank-and-file Republicans who might have preferred a more traditional candidate, like Governor John Kasich or Senator Ted Cruz, soon decided that the party under Trump would advance their views better than the Democratic Party would. And in many important respects, they were absolutely correct. For instance, on issues of corporate and individual taxation, business deregulation, religious freedom, abortion, the politics of the sexual revolution, race-based affirmative action, and judicial appointments. They also calculated that the costs Trump might impose on the nation as a whole through his divisiveness and his lack of government experience would be worth the risk. Evangelicals and many other Christian voters in particular, who widely feel that their backs have been pushed against the wall by Democratic policies on gay rights and LGBTQ issues, especially policies that might require them to act in violation of their religious conscience, thus found ways to justify supporting someone who self-evidently falls considerably short of Christian ideals in his personal behavior. Other Republicans imagined that Trump might be transformed by the responsibilities of the office. Now, it's worth observing here that multi-party parliamentary systems allow voters a somewhat greater opportunity to be ideological purists. In the American presidential system, political interests are cobbled together by mechanisms within our two political parties rather than between leaders of multiple parties in sometimes hidden legislative negotiations, as for instance recently here in Sweden. And voters thus regularly make deep compromises with their political conscience in national elections. And once Trump received the nomination, Republicans fell in line behind their political leader. Now, Trump voters fall into four broad types, each of which in a parliamentary system probably would form its own independent political party. 31% are fiscal conservatives and moral traditionalists who oppose tax increases, resist greater regulation of business, and are skeptical about immigration, especially unlawful immigration. And the number of unlawful immigrants in the United States, of course, is greater than the entire population of Sweden. Importantly, the attitudes of these voters about race generally do not differ appreciably from non-Trump voters. Cross-national comparisons, of course, are difficult, but they're a bit like a mix of your moderates and Christian Democrats, especially the latter. That's the first type, fiscal conservatives and social traditionalists. Next, 25% of Trump voters are economic and social libertarians. This is a highly educated and informed group who are moderate to quite liberal on matters of immigration and race. They're a bit like your liberal party. Next, 20%, that is about 10% of the American electorate overall, are economically progressive ethno-nationalists, similar to your Sweden Democrats. And for this generally poorly educated group, Trump's repeated appeals to racial anxiety were especially important and energizing. Notably, a full half of this group had had positive views of Hillary Clinton in 2012. Finally, 19% are what one survey calls the anti-elites. This is a moderately educated group of voters who are a bit more centrist on issues of immigration than the American Sweden Democrat group, yet who, along with them, importantly, believe that the political and economic system is rigged against them and manipulated by elites of the Davos class. Economically, socially, physically, and psychologically, these people are suffering. Many of them had previously viewed Clinton favorably, and many of them also had been Democrats. They were essential to Trump's victory. Depending on how you count, in 2016, between 9 and 13% of citizens who had voted for Barack Obama and approved of his presidency switched sides and voted for Trump, especially white, male, blue-collar anti-elites in key Midwestern states. Now, on the other side of the aisle, the Democratic Party nominated a candidate, former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, who had a great deal of knowledge, education, and experience, but who was distrusted by many people, and who over the course of the election came to be increasingly distrusted by GOP voters who had once held a favorable view of her. Trump was very effective at generating this distrust, especially through social media, as was Clinton's opponent on the left, Senator Bernie Sanders. They were aided by an FBI investigation into her careless email security practices, and we may know in time what role was played by Russian digital information theft and information warfare. But Clinton didn't do herself any favors either. Like Vice President Al Gore in 2000, and in contrast to Senator Obama in 2008, she was a strikingly ineffective campaigner. At the same time, the Democrats' election strategy rested on the presumption that Republican women would decide that Trump's personal behavior and attitudes about gender were, first, beyond the pale, and second, more important to them than his policies about immigration, trade, abortion, race-based affirmative action, national defense, and foreign wars, and more important, too, than their traditional political identity. The Democratic Party also counted on African Americans turning out at near the level they did when voting for President Obama to preserve his political legacy, and on Latinos surging to the polls. And none of those things happened. Perhaps they were just fantasies to begin with, based on a deep misunderstanding of people and politics. Perhaps it was poor practical organizing on the ground. In the congressional elections of 2018, a significant number of college-educated women in the suburbs did decide that they would abandon their traditional party loyalty, at least temporarily, but that didn't happen 2 years before. The handful of never-Trump Republican intellectuals who rose up and spoke against their party and its nominee, George Will, David Brooks, Bret Stephens, and the like, they made a good deal of noise, but they didn't make much difference with the rank and file. Nor did traditional Republican Party leaders deeply critical of Trump, like former presidential candidate Mitt Romney and the late Senator John McCain. A final crucial factor is that as a nation built on the principle of federalism, the United States doesn't organize its national elections as a general popular vote. Ultimately, the president is chosen from within our 50 states, which are historically analogous to the member nations of the European Union. The vote is thus weighted toward smaller, less populous states, just like parts of the governing structure of the EU don't allocate voters on the simple basis of population. So, for instance, by the Treaty of Lisbon, the seats of the European Parliament are also apportioned, like our Electoral College, in such a way that smaller member states receive greater representation relative to their populace. And that follows a principle known as digressive proportionality. Small states in the EU get proportionally more. Thus, relative to the number of inhabitants they represent, MPs from Sweden are nearly twice as powerful as those from Germany. Within the comparable federalist structure of the American Electoral College, Clinton lost, especially in places like Michigan and Wisconsin, where blue-collar anti-elites defected to the GOP. and where, with echoes of the role played by consumer advocate Ralph Nader in the presidential election of 2000, the left-wing Green Party and the Libertarian Party also drew off key margins. Trump lost the national popular vote by about 46 to 48%. He carried the Federalist Electoral College by about 3-2. So, a hostile takeover of the GOP as an organization, a powerful campaigner with a pugilistic style who appealed to nativist sentiment, a politically ineffective opponent, the resolute holding together of the traditional GOP coalition, and the crucial switch of numerous anti-elites from the Democratic to the Republican camp. That's, I think, the basic electoral story. But did Trump's victory in 2016 have a deeper meaning beyond strategic electoral questions? And how should we think about something called Trumpism as a movement of politics and ideas? If it is a deep ideological movement, one that will last and even grow long after President Trump leaves office, is it orthogonal to the American liberal democratic tradition? I'll begin by considering Trumpism as a political movement, about which one can say in general that Trumpism began as a populist strategy within the Republican Party that enabled it to win the presidential election, which is always close and hotly contested, while holding together its traditional coalition of political interests. And now this winning strategy may be permanently changing the party itself. In considering this issue, an initial comparison might be helpful. The political parties that you have today in Sweden are each the outgrowth of one of three great revolutions of the 19th and 20th centuries: the National Revolution, the Industrial Revolution, and the Proletarian Revolution. These historic pivot points and the cleavages that they created between voting groups left their mark on the Nordic and Swedish party systems as they began to form beginning in the 1880s, and their echoes can still be heard today. The National Revolution, liberals versus conservatives, now moderates. The Industrial Revolution, city dwellers versus agrarians, now the Center Party. The Proletarian Revolution, socialist reformers, the Social Democrats, and communist radicals, the left. Most Swedish parties are inheritors of these historically rooted divisions of interest and perspective. As I noted in Dagens Nyheter shortly after your recent parliamentary elections, the Sweden Democrats can be understood as the product of the latest revolution of world-defining scale, namely globalization. So can the Greens, which is to say that there's an interesting and unexpected link between these otherwise very different parties. And as I'll explain, Trump's victory and Trumpism as a political movement within the GOP can be viewed in this light as well, as a political outgrowth of globalization. Specifically, Trumpism is a populist response to globalization's growing crisis of democratic representation and community identity, one that's been exacerbated by deficiencies in Western liberal thought. Here's what I mean. Globalization, along with the technological changes and liberalization of international economic markets that made it possible, has created extraordinary benefits. But it's a truism to say that it's also created serious problems. Globalization has raised economic boats around the world, but within many Western nations, it's also led to economic stratification and left some people behind in absolute terms. As a social matter, globalization has brought many people together, but it's also increased the cleavage between elites and average people. Globalization does this by fostering an international class with significant loyalties to a world system and decreased loyalties to their native countries. People in this class tend to have increasingly more in common with each other in outlook, style, and interest than they do with everyday people from where they were born. And here, of course, I'm talking about most of us. And among students, for instance, the Erasmus program has been steadily building a transnational leadership elite. Finally, as a matter of cultural identity, globalization has created unprecedented opportunities for individual personal freedom and self-expression, yet the swift flow of people, capital, and goods across borders has also accelerated and deepened what Marx and Engels diagnosed as the psychic and spiritual costs of capitalism. As they wrote in 1848, in some of the most gripping lines of the Communist Manifesto, all fixed, fast-frozen relations with their ancient train of venerable prejudices and opinions are swept away. All new-form ones become antiquated before they can ossify. All that is solid melts into air. All that is sacred is profaned. This deep perception ties together right and left critiques of liberalism today. And I think it's extraordinarily important. In addition to dashing the economic expectations of many average people, globalization has put their social and cultural communities under stress. It's rapidly undermined the self-consciously shared value systems and structures of interdependent mutuality that are essential to human flourishing. Politics has been a primary agent of this globalizing trend. National political parties in modern liberal states have generally been aligned with the interests and outlooks of globalizers, those of us who live in a melted, fluid world. And people left behind can sense that intuitively. Moreover, when political leaders seem to express moralistic disdain for average people and their political choices, that distrust is profoundly amplified. Witness Hillary Clinton and her dismissal of deplorables, used so effectively against her in Trump's campaign. In a world not only of economic stratification, but of sociocultural cosmopolitanism, leaders have lost the basic trust of a large segment of their constituents. Globalization has fostered a profound loss of confidence in elected leaders in what we might call the democratic leadership class. It's created a growing crisis of democratic representation. This state of affairs creates a massive opportunity for political populists who recently have made significant gains across the world, from Brazil to India to Hungary, and in 2016 in the United States, and in 2018 in Sweden. Now, there are many ways to define populism. It's a huge academic debate. For my concerns as a cultural historian, and here I should say I'm loosely adapting a model developed by the political science scientist Pierre Ostigi, what's important is that populists on both the left and the right tend to locate themselves on the same side of a binary cultural opposition between the low and the high in three linked socio-political domains. Now, the terms low and high here aren't synonyms for good and bad. They're simply descriptive. They're comparable to the anthropological distinction made by Claude Lévi-Strauss between the raw and the cooked. One of the great insights that comes from structuralist cultural anthropology is that binary oppositions like these, in which each term is conceivable only in contrast to the other, there's no low without the high, there's no raw without the cooked, those underlie not only all systems of human myth, but most cultural forms, including those of politics. And populists are semiotic warriors of the low. The first domain is that of personal style. A candidate's style can range from coarse and warm and uninhibited, the low, to proper and distanced and sublimated, the high. Populist candidates, in Ostagi's definition, flaunt the low in opposition to the high as an instrument of political mobilization to get people to vote for them and to work on their behalf. The politically motivating power of the stylistic low is so great in this respect that it obliterates even tangible distinctions of material economic class. Donald Trump has access to vast wealth, but his taste is widely derided as coarse, which only encourages many voters to identify with him as a champion. In this light, every time the Euro-American elite expressed public distaste at small status markers of Trump's lack of cosmopolitan refinement, for instance, his love of fast food or his flamboyant hair, conspicuously signaling their own greater cultural capital, they reinforced the low-high binary that Trump uses so effectively as an instrument of party mobilization. We can appreciate Trump's use of Twitter in this light as well. One of the important features of the US presidency as an office is that enormous expectations are placed on it to solve social problems. Yet within our structure of limited and divided government, its power, in fact, is significantly checked. One source of the power that the president does, however, is the ability to reach out to American voters directly and ask for support, a process called going public. By going public, a president can put pressure on members of Congress to push through the political promises that the president made on the campaign trail. So as a way to meet the crisis of representation, then, President Trump uses the latest communications media, as President Roosevelt once used radio, to reach voters directly in a common voice, with typos and idiosyncrasies serving as markers of his authenticity, and thereby to increase his power vis-a-vis the legislature. His low Twitter style advances his interests within the challenging institutional structure and partisan deadlock of American politics. The second domain of the populist low is a candidate's or movement's sociocultural orientation toward local, geographic, and community attachments. This orientation can range from a nationalist or nativist low, in which local attachment is preeminent, to a cosmopolitan or globalist high, where loyalties are multinational, transnational, or even universal. A local community orientation doesn't necessarily follow from a candidate's personal style, but the two are often closely linked. For instance, Trump the man bears strong cultural and linguistic markers as hailing from a specific neighborhood in New York City, Queens. At the same time, President Trump has centered his domestic policy agenda around anti-immigration politics and economic protection of traditional industry. And in foreign affairs, he's encapsulated his governing philosophy with the phrase America first. That is, his policy concerns are inward and marked as local, just like his personal style. Brexiteers have a parallel identity orientation. Cosmopolitans, by contrast, conceive of their identity in terms that spill over borders or that are directed toward abstract principles. They're citizens of the world. Their community affiliation is often as much to a specific field or profession, such as, say, science, as it is to a place or group of people, as is their policy orientation, for instance, toward global development aid or international institutions. This attitude should be familiar, of course, here in Sweden, as Sweden often presents itself as having strong elements of cosmopolitanism within its national self-concept. The final populist domain is that of political decision-making structure. On one side of this binary is the low of personalistic and anti-institutional decision-making, most prominently among Latin American authoritarians, but also in the United States now by the head of a family business who went into politics. As Trump declared at the National GOP Convention in 2016, I alone can fix it, which in a family business enterprise was frequently the case by design. The Trump organization is very closely held. What a preference for personalistic decision-making entails is a skepticism about the complex liberal legal architecture that structures and places limits on majority will, such as courts. On the other side of the binary is the high of proceduralist, bureaucratic formalism. This decision-making style disperses power across a range of rule-bound government institutions. Doing so obviously provides many benefits, predictability and transparency foremost among them, but it also can raise deep concerns about democracy by attenuating lines of political accountability. That's essentially the critique of the EU offered from a perspective of democratic legitimacy. Max Weber explored this low-high binary in his seminal analysis of charismatic versus bureaucratic authority. This distinction is really especially important and pertinent in the United States today because surveys reveal a dramatic decline of trust in traditional institutions, especially among non-college educated Euro-Americans. Their trust, in fact, is well below that of people of color, and it's been declining steadily since the 1970s. Notably, in all three of its domains, style, identity orientation, and political structure, the low has something in common. It's all about proximity and speed. Personal formality is understood as distant, whereas the common touch fosters a rapid interpersonal connection. A cosmopolitan holds loyalties to far away, whereas the local is immediately present, loyalty to this place right here. In contrast to the bureaucratic process, personalistic decision-making is anti-formalist and swift. As a political response to globalization, then, the populist low collapses the interpersonal distance between politician and citizen and thereby promises to shrink political distance and accelerate democratic responsiveness. If we can speak of Trumpism as a party movement within the GOP that will last over the long term, this is to a good degree, I think, what we're talking about. There's no real equivalent to Trumpism at the level of state or local government, but at the national level, Trumpism is a mix of populist low rhetoric and nativist policies that enables the Republican Party in a globalized world to woo a sufficient margin of disaffected Democratic anti-elites into its camp so as to achieve electoral victory, while continuing to hold together its traditional coalition of social and fiscal conservatives and libertarians. Can there be a viable center-right in America that rejects nativism and perhaps more generally eschews the populist low? Is the Republican Party's face permanently set in this expression? I think that's a question that will be answered over the course of the next 10 years. But is Trumpism something even more? Does Trump's presidency signal the growth of a movement of political ideas in America that will outlast the administration and that diverges philosophically from the broad liberal tradition? Answering this question is difficult because in contrast with Europe, American political culture isn't especially given to the articulation of consistent ideological or philosophical platforms, right? Tellingly, the most important publisher of alt-right philosophical materials in the United States today, arguably, is Arctos Media, founded in Sweden, which publishes beautiful translated editions of dangerous anti-liberal books by thinkers such as the Russian traditionalist Alexander Dugin. Yet there are figures within President Trump's circle with clear anti-liberal, even anti-Enlightenment philosophical tendencies. For instance, his campaign advisor, Steve Bannon, and the intellectuals associated with the Claremont Review of Books. And in their writings, as well as in President Trump's political posture and rhetoric more generally, Trumpism may be starting to cohere as a true anti-liberal ideology. I don't think we're there yet, but the seeds have been planted. More specifically, Trumpism as a developing ideology resonates strikingly with the 20th century's most significant critique of modern liberal society, that of the German legal theorist Carl Schmitt, who lived from 1888 to 1985. Now, it's important to state up front that Schmitt was a prominent legal advisor to the Nazis. That's how he's generally known. But that's less significant to me, much less, than the fact that his critique of liberalism has reverberated into all the important varieties of anti-liberal thought today, including decidedly anti-fascist varieties of left-wing radicalism. Crucially, Schmidt's critique of liberalism identifies and proposes solutions to the distinctive problems raised by globalization that liberalism has struggled to address. In particular, it speaks to the hollowing out of politics and community that's part of our contemporary historical moment. It speaks to all that solid melting into air. Here's his basic argument. Whereas according to the standard liberal account, a political community forms when people with divergent interests enter into a social contract. For Schmidt, political community comes into being when its members recognize some aspect of their common existence and hold it to be worth defending with their lives. On this basis, a people distinguishes between its friends and its enemies, whom they're ultimately prepared to fight to defend what makes their community special. A political community, that is created through an animating sense of identity and threat. That's how the political, as a fundamental sphere of human value, emerges, and how it provides the cultural foundation of sovereignty and the state for a community of equals. The political, a domain of independent human value, analogous to the aesthetic, the spiritual, or the economic, is based on simultaneous affiliation and opposition. Significantly, Schmidt believes that drawing the friend-enemy distinction is a quasi-theological duty and part of what it means to be fully human. Without the distinction, true political life would vanish, and without it, something essential to humanity would vanish too. Human existence would be reduced to mere private hedonism, the pursuit simply of personal pleasure, a critique that's often made of liberal cosmopolitanism. One could express Schmidt's worldview in this respect in theologically positive terms, as the progressive American legal scholar Paul Kahn has done, as a politics based on love. For Schmidt, the political is founded on the essential mutual regard of community members for what they share beneath their surface-level differences. That recognition justifies the state's demand that citizens be prepared to make the ultimate sacrifice in its name. And for Schmidt, it forms the philosophical precondition of law itself. Two corollaries grow from this conception of politics, and together I think they link President Trump's domestic and international politics together, showing how they're two sides of the same philosophical coin. First, for Schmidt, a community's ability to draw the friend-enemy distinction, by definition, can brook no conceptual or institutional restraint. Most notably, the distinction can't be predicated on other domains of human value, such as morals, aesthetics, or economics. And this is a principle that liberals today regularly violate, quite purposefully. For instance, they seek to circumscribe national sovereignty conceptually within universal legal and moral norms, such as individual human dignity, most famously in Article 1 of the German Basic Law, and they seek to restrict it through political institutions like the United Nations. Schmidt views such liberal projects not simply as naive, but also as a recipe for social chaos at home and unrestrained imperialistic violence abroad. On the domestic level, he argues, when liberals predicate the friend-enemy distinction on ideals drawn from other value domains, they undermine the state by confusing their community's own self-understanding. Who are we if our state owes basic responsibilities to everyone? And such uncertainty chips away at what President Trump in Poland, warning about the fate of the West, described as a community's will to survive. It also leaves the state vulnerable to capture and abuse by self-interested private groups because its essential duties and commitments become unclear. The state is vulnerable to capture, for instance, by representatives of one economic industry or another. A parallel problem exists on the international stage. In Schmitt's view, the liberal effort to circumscribe national sovereignty within universalistic legal and moral criteria increases the possibility of total war. By moralizing conflict, liberals become disinclined to make deals with their opponents to limit war's scope. They transform conventional enemies into absolute enemies against whom fighting can never truly cease because that fighting is moralized. That's why the Cold War, for instance, for Schmitt, was a truly civilizational battle. At the same time, liberals seek to reconstruct other societies in their own image. After all, they base their own political identity on universalistic criteria. They want all societies to follow their basic principles. President Trump is thus consistent with Schmitt in pursuing a transactional rather than a rules-based foreign policy, and in insisting that the American goal in Afghanistan and the Middle East should be killing terrorists, not nation building. Both Schmittianism and Trumpism in this respect contain a genuine and striking normative pluralism. A second important corollary to Schmitt's conception of politics is that as the bearer of a people's sovereignty, the state needs to create clear territorial boundaries that correspond to its friend-enemy distinction. If the territory of a state doesn't align with that distinction, then the identity of its underlying political community becomes muddled. This process mirrors spatially the confusion that results when liberals seek to circumscribe sovereignty conceptually. Accordingly, at the heart of Trump's campaign was his promise to build a great wall along the border between the United States and Mexico. And while this is a genuine policy proposal meant to solve a social problem, it's also very much a political and cultural symbol. And as a symbol, it's profoundly Schmittian in two ways. First, it expresses the Schmittian position that a community's political obligation should be physically legible. Indeed, Schmitt himself once explained that the normative order of a political community, quote, can be described as a wall. Second, it expresses the Schmittian view that only by clearly drawing the friend-enemy distinction can a state commit to mutual support and solidarity. As a senior Trump advisor, Stephen Miller, put it in a statement nearly incomprehensible, I wrote nearly, but totally incomprehensible, on current liberal terms, we're going to build that wall, and we're going to build it out of love, right? That's the spirit, at least in part, with which the slogan, "Build that wall," is sometimes chanted at rallies. It's not simply a spirit of xenophobia, ethnocentrism, racism, but also liberals need to acknowledge for their own interest one of shared good humor and good times, right? With an eye not only toward the enemy, but toward the friend. Schmitt's view about the relation between politics and geography is reflected in his views about international order as well. And this, too, has deep Trumpian parallels. Like President Trump, Schmitt rejects the ideal of a global order sustained through international legal institutions like the United Nations. In aspiring to limit the ability of their members to declare war, he argues, such institutions ultimately seek, quote, to transform the world into a global Rechtsstaat, an ideal for Schmitt as spiritually undesirable as it is practically impossible. In contrast, he argues, the cause of peace and stability would be better served through an international order of sovereign states defined by their commitment to the political and its territorialization. He thereby advocates rooting global order more deeply in the ideal of national sovereignty and extending the principles of the Monroe Doctrine to all major players on the international stage. In Schmitt's vision of a sustainable and truly pluralistic world order, great nations stake out zones of geographic influence and afford each other mutual regard across those physical boundaries. Indeed, According to Schmidt, nations that are strong enough to impose their own internal political homogeneity need to ally with each other against nations and groups that undermine the territorialization of the friend-enemy distinction. And by this logic, it's not Russia so much as Islamic extremism and liberal cosmopolitanism that are America's true enemies. And in fact, Russia can be an important ally against both of them. And that may be an especially concerning proposition here in largely demilitarized Sweden in light of the Russian threat to the Baltic states. One thinks of President Boris Yeltsin's appeal to President Bill Clinton in Istanbul in 1999. Bill, give Europe to Russia, President Yeltsin asked directly, and let Russia provide for European security. The ultimate concern we might have in this regard is that a Schmittian philosophy of international order ultimately will be embraced by American voters as they grow increasingly frustrated by the lack of European defense capability and longstanding European anti-American sentiment. So, for Schmitt, political community and politics itself arises from a sense of common values and from the friend-enemy distinction, a robust sense of who we are. That distinction is the foundation of sovereignty and law. It's essential to what it means to be human. It brooks no conceptual or institutional restraint, and it requires territorialization. All have analogs in President Trump's domestic and international policy. What I've presented to you here are three different perspectives on the subject of Donald Trump: electoral, political, and philosophical. These issues naturally aren't independent from each other. They're interlocking. And I think we can perceive a common theme running through them, one that will be essential for liberals to appreciate if they're to sustain their democratic political project into the future. In one way or another, each perspective implicates the tie between community identity and a sense of geographic place. Trump achieved electoral victory in 2016 by speaking to a loss of trust in government among struggling anti-elites in the Midwest, deploying the populist low in the service of nativist policies, and pursuing an agenda that accords with a Schmittian philosophical vision of the relation between people, politics, and geography. Put another way, Democrats lost in 2016 because they forgot where they live. Populist movements are succeeding across the globe because they don't make that mistake. And a Schmittian anti-liberalism makes its theoretical claims about community on a spatial field. If liberals are to successfully defend their values in a globalized era in which all that's solid is melting into air, I think that they'll need to confront the relation between community and place in both practice and theory in a variety of social and political contexts. I have some thoughts about how to do that, which I hope to consider in some Swedish publications soon. And perhaps we could talk about them one-on-one at the reception. I advocate especially the creation of a robust yet inclusive sense of civic place as a parallel to the sense of geographic place and as a touchstone of solidity within a fluid world. Put in terms appropriate, I hope, to this particular university, I think that liberals should foster a popular understanding of national constitutional law parallel to that which Linnaeus advocated in relation to plants as he and his students walked the paths around Uppsala. Know your plants, know your laws, identify and cultivate what's civically distinctive and sustaining about where you live. But as we are, I think, about to reach the witching hour, let me conclude by saying simply this. These are issues that confront Swedes as much as they do Americans. We share them together. And because they are common issues, I'll close this talk in recognition of the Swedish Institute for North American Studies, SINAS, which has been my institutional home during these 7 months, and also with a special eye toward my students who I see here in the audience and whose final exam is tomorrow. And exclaim that no matter what your views about these complex matters or about my country, what an ideal, incredibly important time it is to be studying the United States. Thank you.